again, Benedict, it was a pleasure as always. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So yes, I really appreciate to have the opportunity to show a little bit about what does it take to get your medical device software or your software in a medical device to the Chinese market. And yeah, so I think when we look back, maybe before 2012 or 2013, it was quite easy to get instruments and medical device software into the Chinese market. You usually had to hand in your DOC and you had to hand in your operator's manual, and that was it. Then the Chinese government changed their mind. There was a so-called Order 650 introduced, and with this Order 650, the registration work in China became very hard. Yes, so and at that time, the president had the goal to make the Chinese medical device regulations the most stringent in the world. So he wanted to even overtake the US. And so therefore, I would like to give you some information regarding the medical device software in China. So what are the definitions there? I would like to take you to the process for software registration in China. And I would like to give you just a very brief outlook on the documents required for registrations in China. And also, once you brought your product on the Chinese market, you have to deal with software changes, because also those software changes would require, for sure, then change registration in certain cases. So let's start with medical device software in China. So what are the definitions? So the Chinese regulations, and I updated that presentation based on very recent regulations coming out in March this year. So medical device software could be software as a medical device. And in this case, it could be a general purpose standalone software, or it could be a dedicated standalone software. Sounds familiar, maybe from other regulations. So what's important for that, the keywords here are, it needs to have a medical purpose, and it's not part of a hardware medical device. So it's not like for example, a software that runs an analyzer, or that runs a medical device for patient diagnostic. And it runs on a general computing platform. So computing platform could be a separate PC, but it could be also a mobile application or a tablet. Then maybe in contrast to what you might know from other regulations in other parts of the world, the Chinese software regulations also refer to so-called software components. And these are not what you might think of, it's not off-the-shelf software or things like that, but it's either an embedded software component or an external control software component. And here, both of them need to have a medical purpose, and they control or drive directly the medical device hardware. So this could be, for example, firmware. So maybe in contrast to what we know from European regulations or from US regulations, where FDA, for example, says, well, firmware we treat them the same as hardware. Here, the Chinese regulation really understand by the embedded software component also firmware. It could also be a software component that's on an external control software, on external device. So that means, for example, you would have a second PC connected to a medical device, and that second PC connected to your medical device has then that software, and this is then intended to control your medical device, for example, a PC separate from the integrated boards of an analyzer. Or it could be also really a separate PC connected to the PC of your analyzer. But this PC maybe has some kind of software that's, for example, triggering retesting of certain samples due to certain conditions. Or it could be an external PC where further result calculation is done. So these are the medical device software definitions for China. And I would like to share some experiences we made recently with the registration here. So when it comes to the classification, when you compare that with US and China, we made the experience that, for example, you would have a software on a PC that controls an IVD analyzer, and it calculates the results, and it would be then considered embedded software according to the IVDR. So this would be the classical software you have on an analyzer that includes the program for handling the application, for handling the assay, for maybe calculating then the result and maybe modifying the result and send it to the host, to the LIS, for example. And so you may think the classification might be similar in China, but according to recent experience, the Chinese reviewer considered the same software external control software component. So that was really something because you may think, okay, you may have just outsourced certain software functionality that you usually would have on the analyzer software, but you have a second PC and you do maybe result calculation on that, or further result calculation or modification of the result. And so based on that, it results then in higher documentation needs. So what is the key takeaway message here? So when you will want to start software registration in China, you may not always rely on what you have defined already for IVDR or for FDA submissions. You may need to go back and restart really the classification in China. Another experience I would like to share is software safety classification in China. So in the latest regulation, it's no longer called safety or risk classification. It's now called security level. But basically, the classification is based on the rules of IEC 62304. I think that's a good news. But depending on the intended use of the software or of the device the software is embedded in or is running, the authority may have predefined safety classification. So, and this might be different for you from your internal classification. So be aware, consider always the application you have, consider the type of analyzer you have before you start working on those documents, because that might drive the need to change the classification in your submission documents. And also you may have possible different documentation requirements. And if you would submit then your original documents, the reviewer might be confused, because I think this is also maybe different from the reviewers you have, for example, in the US, who have a well-established system. as I said before, China built up the know-how and the authorities for medical devices, for software and instrument registration just 10 years ago, and they are still building up resources. So what those people are usually doing, they really go line by line in the regulation. So, and they may not have the flexibility and the openness to discuss compared to another country's reviewer. So what is the process for software registration in China? And this is also slightly different maybe from the process you may have in other countries. So when you do your software or instrument development, and you have to consider an additional step in China, which we call the so-called software or instrument type testing. So what is the type testing? The type testing is a test based on Chinese regulations or Chinese standards that you would have to perform at a governmental Chinese laboratory. So these are laboratories like we have the accredited laboratories here in Europe as well, or also in the US, but these are accredited or certified by the Chinese government. And only after you finish that testing at that laboratory, you can then submit your documents. You can start your actual submission. So that means you have differently from the US or from the EU, you have an external company that has to do certain type testing and that might perform certain tests differently from the way you did that during your development, and therefore you may want to pay attention also to those standards that will be used later on in type testing. And maybe also it takes quite long. So coming to the experiences regarding timelines, so if you have instrument, including software type testing, this can take roughly 6 months or longer, depending on the questions that the laboratory may have. If you have a standalone software, that might be much shorter, but still you need to calculate at least a few months for the type testing that needs to be done before you can start your actual submission. So the process usually starts, as I said before, you define your software requirements and your software specifications. You test the software according to your internal procedures. You perform cybersecurity engineering, and you do also certain cybersecurity testing. And when you want to go to the Chinese market, you need to create the so-called performance technical requirements documents. I would call that the PTR document. So what is this document like? This is a document that describes the specification of your analyzer or of your medical device and the software, or if you have standalone software, it would just describe your software. And it describes it in a way that all the specifications that are needed according to the Chinese standards are listed in there. This document will be created by you as a manufacturer. However, the first time this document will be reviewed, this will be reviewed by your type testing laboratory. So you may have certain discussions with your type testing laboratory because they need to take that PTR document and they will use that also to verify your software and your analyzer. So this is a very important document because also later on, this document will be part of your submission. And then it will be reviewed by the reviewer. So that means this document based on the applicable standards. And as I said before, there are different standards for analyzers, also depending on the softwares or on the analyzer's intended use. They will confirm the PTR specifications, and they may also come back to you and ask you how certain things can be tested at your software or at your device, because that type testing lab may not always be familiar with your product. And so you need to make sure that you also have an operator's manual available, so that that lab is able to actually handle your device. And in some cases, it might also be helpful if you would have somebody either going to China or being in China, being able to directly communicate with that type testing laboratory to make sure that in case there would be questions how something could be tested or how your device should be operated, you have somebody on site to help with questions and answers. And then finally, you can start your software's submission. And what you need to submit, you need to submit then also what they call the research documentation. So all your internal documents that you created during the development. And what's also important, the PTR will be part of your license. So you will get an approval of the PTR by the authority, and this is the base for the product you will then be able to bring to the Chinese market. And that means whenever you change your software version or whenever any of those specifications that are defined in that PTR will be changed, you will have to consider a possible change submission. I think this is also something to keep in mind. And so regarding the some experiences we made, and some key takeaways for you here. So you should really consider the Chinese standards very early in the development, because these might drive certain specifications. This might drive the possible testability of your product during type testing. And this might also drive the specification you have, that this meets, that your final product meets also then the Chinese standards, because otherwise you don't get the approval of the type testing laboratory. And the Chinese software guidances are really strictly built on IEC 62304. As I said before, that's basically good news, but you should really strictly follow those regulations, because the reviewer, what they have in mind is really that they receive the documents in a way from you how it's exactly defined in the IEC standard. And it might happen that based on the intended use of your instrument, you may be required to provide separate sets of software documentation, maybe software functions sorted by the different intended use. So that means you may want to prepare your software documentation for later required segregation. So I think it will start with a good requirements management, specification management, and testing. You may decide very early in the process to have a good concept for segregation, or that will allow you later on to do the segregation based on what China requires. Because also here the software reviewers are very strict. If they find something in one set of the documentation that should not belong there but should belong to the other set, they may send you back those documents for cleanup, and they may not accept those. And in the PTR, you may have certain software, internal software or IT infrastructure specifications. So for example, if you have a PC that has specific connections, that has a specific version of USB protocols that it's using, or other infrastructure specifications, you should really make sure that those infrastructure specifications are consistent with what you deliver later on for the type testing and what you intend to place later on the market, because you will get this PTR license, and this allows you only to bring those products on the market that exactly meet the PTR. And regarding type testing, you may want to consider for planning of the type testing that you need to provide the laboratory a so-called commercial version of the software. So sometimes when you have early development, or when you plan to do still some bug fixing, but the software is already good to go, you may have not the final version written in your about box or on your DVD, depending on how you distribute your software. But please keep in mind that the type testing report you will have to hand over, this report will have to refer to the exact version as it's written on your label, or as it's written on your about screen. And so if you have a development version, you will not get the approval then by the type testing laboratory. And when it comes to software submission preparation, you may want to structure the software documentation based on the required electronic format. So the Chinese regulation have a so-called EREPS system. That's an electronic system where you will upload your submission document to a database, and this has a specific structure based also on the regulation. And this is also how you then later on will get the feedback. So when there are any observation, the reviewer will exactly point to those modules that you uploaded, or to those documents that you uploaded. And therefore, I think you may want to start for the planning to follow this EREPS structure, which I think is a way that we also have in the US. You may know the E-STAR program from the FDA, where also FDA offers at least to submit electronically and not to send a lot of paper anymore. As I mentioned before, many reviewers will be quite new in the business, and they have been trained maybe very well on the regulations, and therefore they will always look for exactly those terms and those keywords that they need to check mark then during their review. Therefore, my recommendation would be use always the terms and the titles of sections when you structure your submission documents, always according to the Chinese regulations. So you will prepare very likely an English version, and there are more or less officially translated. It's not really officially translated by the Chinese government, but there are quite some official terms you may use. And then you may have to have a Chinese translated version of your submission documents as well. And so make sure that you use exact terms that are also used in the regulation. That's sometimes difficult, I know, because your internal documentation may be based on IVDR, or it might be based on FDA terms, and we should really make sure that we don't infringe that rule, because I think it might lead to a lot of questions. Yeah, so you will get questions from the reviewer if the reviewer does not immediately find the term he or she would be looking for. And then be careful with software versions. So as I said before, you will receive the license based on the PTR version you submitted. And so that means your software version that you can then place on the market in China will be based on the version you submitted. So when we look at the usual approval timelines, meaning you finished your development, you start your type testing, which may take 3 to 6 to 7 months. Then you have the review period. And for an initial submission, it might take at least 1 year. So the review of your submission documentation and the feedback cycle may result together with that type testing in nearly 1.5 or even more, 1.5 a year or even more time. So by that time, your internal lifecycle work will already be progressed. You will have a very new fancy version with new fancy functions, but you may not always be able then to market that version in China because you have that based on what you submitted. So therefore, you may want to think a little bit ahead. So when you have in mind to do a major update of your software, maybe it's worth to wait a few months before you have that update implemented and then submit the updated version rather than starting the submission on an old version and then get the approval for an old version and need to do change submissions. So what are the documents required for registrations? And I just want to give you here a very brief overview. So you need to have certain internal documents, so-called manufacturer's documents. And when you look at that list here, you will find many documents that are mentioned also in the ISC 62304, or that you know maybe already from FDA submissions. So you will have to submit your software architecture chart with structural functions, software physical topology diagram. That's maybe different from what you would do for US FDA. So China is interested in having really the relationship between your software and its location on the hardware. You need to describe the software operating environment, the software core functions. You need to provide the software risk assessment, and please make sure that you don't mix that up maybe with a product risk assessment, that it's really your software risk assessment. You need to provide for sure certain information related to your off-the-shelf software, the risk assessment, specification, V&V activities, software requirement specifications, but you also need to provide software V&V plans and report. And the amount or the depth will depend on your classification. And you see here, we are in a similar situation like we are with the US FDA. Previously, it was possible to have provided more or less summary reports. Now the reviewers with the new software regulation that came out in March will also start requiring your actual test reports with the usual contents like acceptance criteria, test steps, and test results. You need to provide your trace matrix, so your traceability analysis, your software anomalies and the process, how you handle them, software versioning, and a software development overview. In addition, you need to provide cybersecurity documents, and China is focusing more and more on cybersecurity. So those documents are very similar to what you would provide in the US. However, there are slight differences regarding the composition or the structure of those documents. And here again, make sure that you consider the latest cybersecurity guidance for medical devices in China to make sure you have all the contents that are required, but also the formats and the structure that the reviewer will expect here. And maybe a little bit different from the US submissions, you also need to provide those parts of your instructions for use that are cybersecurity related. You then, as I mentioned before, need to provide also as external document the type testing reports. So there will be a software type testing report where certain functions of your software will be tested. If you have an instrument also, this will go together with the instrument test report. But there will be also a so-called cybersecurity test report. So the external laboratory will also test certain items on your cybersecurity. And the PTR, as mentioned before. So then hopefully you will have a successful submission done, you will receive your license. And then the big question, how to deal with software changes. You should deal with them very wisely, and you should plan them very wisely for China, like Confucius said. So first question, when do new software versions require change submissions? So there are general definitions. So the Chinese regulation, when it comes to software updates, differentiate between major software updates that could be what they call major enhanced updates or recall related software updates. So in general, any software update that may affect the intended use or the way the customer uses the software or the instrument, or it would consider core functions like improvements, or if you adapt the software to a new hardware or external software environment. These would be considered major software updates, and those major software updates will require change submission. So that means if you have a new function and this new function will contribute to a different clinical decision way, then the Chinese authority would consider that a major enhanced update and would require you, before you can place that version on the market, would require you to submit a software change submission. Also, when it comes to critical to recalls, then you may also be requested to provide then as a change submission. Different to that, there would be then what would be considered the minor software update, and that could be what the Chinese regulation calls slightly enhanced update, or a corrective software update, or just a simple new software build that you had to make to do a patch. Maybe, for example, if there are new cybersecurity requirements and you do a new patch, then you may make just a new build without hopefully changing the software. And these would be then software updates that do not affect the safety and effectiveness of medical devices, like bug fixes or updates of non-critical functions, so non-core software functions. So keeping that in mind, I would like to share some experiences here with you. So there you may have software changes that meet your internal criteria for minor changes, or that would meet your criteria for major changes. And you, based on that, you decide based on your internal SOP how you assign the software versioning. It's important to know that in the Chinese software guidance, the Chinese regulations have some ideas what should be considered major and minor software update and how your software versioning should follow that. So for example, if you change the first digit of your software version, according to the Chinese regulation, this would be considered to be a major software update. And major software update for them means you would have to submit. But when you look through the definitions that I just presented on the slide before, it's maybe not actually a major software update. So I think it's important to consider also the Chinese rules for software versioning for internal procedures, because you may end up that you think, okay, I can place this software version, this new software version on the Chinese market because I did not change core functions. I just have a bug fix version, or I changed maybe some non-critical functions. But according to your internal procedures, you changed the first digit, for example. And if that gets known by the authorities, you may come in trouble, because the authorities will tell you, well, you changed your first digit, so it's a major software update. You should have sent in a submission before you place that on the market. Therefore, you may want to consider those rules and those definitions of software updates also in your SOPs for versioning of your software, because that will avoid unnecessary discussions with the authority, and it may prevent you also from unnecessary change submissions. Because for the change submissions, you may have to provide more or less the same set of documents that you need to provide for an initial submission. And the set of documents must describe then the delta between your version that you once submitted and that version that you now want to place on the market. And since you may have had several minor changes in between, it might sum up quite a lot of information, because you would have to then describe the changes between several versions you did in the meantime. So I think even sometimes we like to keep our software versioning rules because they are well established in the company. It might be good once you decided to go to the Chinese market to also consider that in your internal procedures. And also when it comes to software changes of IT infrastructure that may have impact on your PTR specifications. So for example, whenever Windows decide to have a new operating system launched because the older one is no longer supported, you may come into the situation that you would need to do a software change submission. You may not have changed your software at all. You may just have done some minor modifications to your software to make it running on the new operating system. However, according to Chinese regulations, you might be required to do a change submission. And as usually this may concern all your products at once, then you have to send in quite a lot of submission documents. Therefore, it's wise to consider upcoming changes when creating the PTR for the initial submission, and also for planned renewals, because every 5 years after you receive your license, you have to do a renewal. That means you need to hand in again a full set of documents describing the changes between the version that you got the approval for initially and what's the version that you now have on the market. So that's also a big difference to, for example, the US. So therefore, you may want to consider upcoming changes when creating the PTR for the initial submission and for your planned renewals. So you may want to try to keep the specifications as wide as possible. I think it's still worth to discuss with your type testing laboratory and with your reviewer to accept maybe a wider specification still. And you may want to consider latest versions whenever possible. So as I said before, if there is an upcoming new version, you may rather want to wait a few months before you start your submission and already consider that new version despite of having then later doing a change approval, because you want to be with your latest software version always also on the Chinese market to keep your customers happy. And with that, I wish you good luck. And in China, it means when a coming horse comes, that brings a luck to you. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sonja. Wow, that I feel chills down my spine when I hear all this. It sounds very bureaucratic, very dogmatic.
It is, yeah. So it's very bureaucratic. It's really what you have in mind. Maybe some people have in mind with German authorities. No, Chinese authorities can be even more bureaucratic than maybe German authorities could be. I can say that I'm a German, and yes.
Okay, so you almost sound impressed what they can do. I mean, you state here that there are Chinese standards that we should consider when we do this. There are other Chinese public documents that we need to consider. Where can I find these?
So I listed a few of them here, and you may also find them on the NMPA website. You may have that. I may also provide you later on, maybe with standards and guidance documents that you could also then publish on your web page. That would be also possible.
I think that would be very, very well appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
I got one question in the chat here, and I think they read between the lines, and the question goes, doesn't this basically mean that they don't want us, the non-Chinese, in their market?
Yes. So we sometimes get the impression, I think it's a little bit, I think they try to keep it balanced. They want to place a very high burden, because I think they want to make sure that the products that come into the country meet their requirements. But I have to say also the Chinese local products have to fulfill the same regulations. Yeah, so I think it would not be fair here to say that they may meet different regulations. There might be different negotiations then when submitting. But I think they are interested specifically when there are new techniques. Yeah, so China opens the way. If you have a very innovative product, they even now have an innovative registration pathway. So they are interested in very innovative products. But yes, they make it not that easy for us to enter the Chinese market.
All right. I mean, you keep coming back to the 62304, and that they want to follow this very dogmatic, using the terms, which means that if I have, I should follow that very strictly. I understand that, and when it comes into cybersecurity, where 62304 is a little bit weak or a little bit thin, are there other standards that I should look in particular to when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think for cybersecurity, you may want to focus on the guidelines for cybersecurity. I think that would be a good starting point. And this guidance is also referring to certain standards that you may want to follow. There are Chinese standards. Many of them are based on international standards. However, they have always some additional items for the Chinese version of that standard.
Okay, and when you say the cybersecurity guidelines, you mean the FDA, the FDA guidelines?
No, there's China. China has their own cybersecurity guidance. And they just recently issued, I think in March, they also issued a new one this year, and you may want to follow that latest guidance.
Yeah, and this brings us into something else that we talked about before the show, that they happily update their standards and procedures and documents, and they have a fairly short lead time before they starting being have to be used. Isn't that so?
Exactly. So usually the lead time is they gave you just a few weeks, and it might happen that you start a submission and the reviewer may not have yet accepted that submission to be in the official review process. The reviewer may already point you to the new guidance documents. So you may also want to monitor what's on the horizon, what's coming up, and you may get surprises even within your submission process. Yes.
Wow. So we have a lethal combination here of fairly long lead times, fairly long test periods, but very swift turnaround times when it comes to standards and guidance documents.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's you need to really start monitoring those guidance documents, and you really need to become agile, I think. Yeah. You really need to. You cannot just have a plan and follow the plan for the next years. You really need to react on that in a very agile manner.
All right. And I mean, the elephant in the room here, in order to submit a product to China, do I need to speak Chinese?
No, you don't need to speak Chinese. So you need to have your submission documents translated. And I think the issue might be if you don't have somebody speaking Chinese, you may have some issues when answering maybe their feedback. Yeah, so I would recommend to have at least somebody in your quality regulatory or R&D organization being able to speak Chinese to maybe also have some communication, because what's also possible after you submit it, you may have also telephone conferences with them, and these unfortunately need to be in Chinese.
Wow. All right. I'm going to download the Duolingo app right now. This has been a pleasure, Sonja. Great to have you on the show. I very much appreciate sharing your concrete experiences and your best practices from your time at Roche, applying for those submissions or submitting those packages to China in order to get the Roche software, and I guess successfully placed there, right?
Yes, we have products in China, yes.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Sonja. We're on to the next speaker.